Hi, RPSE 465. This is the asynchronous lecture content on what is language for week 1, session 1. A definition of language that I'll pose is that language is a single dimension of human behavior that consists of 3 interrelated domains. These are represented on the slide with 3 overlapping circles that feature the words form, content, and use. To explain what these mean, I'm going to use the example of Adelaide, a female 3-year-old girl who made the utterances, "I beating you up the stairs," "I won," "I am so fast." These utterances provide an array of analytical possibilities for characterizing Adelaide's language. We can first look at the form. This is an example of how words, sentences, and sounds are organized and arranged to convey content. Form refers to such things as sentence structure, clause and phrase usage, parts of speech, verb and noun structures, word prefixes, suffixes, and the organization of sound into words. So the terms phonology, morphology, and syntax apply to the form of Adelaide's language. In her utterances, she uses 3 simple sentences. The first one contains a prepositional phrase, "up the stairs." She uses various parts of speech like nouns, for example, stairs, pronouns like I. She uses adverbs like so, and verbs like beating or won. Adelaide also uses a number of speech sounds, including a variety of vocalic sounds like vowels and several consonantal sounds like w and b. Form refers to how the sentences are structured. Each of Adelaide's sentences contain a subject, in which all of the cases is a personal pronoun, I. Each sentence contains a predicate or verb. She uses 3 different verb structures. In the first sentence, "I beating you up the stairs," she uses the transitive verb beating, which requires an object, you. Note that although she has inflected the verb beat with the present progressive marker ing to show that the action is occurring continuously in the present, she's also omitted the auxiliary verb am. That would sound like "I am beating you up the stairs." She omitted that. In the second sentence, Adelaide uses the verb wonned. In this case, she's produced the irregular past tense form of win, but added the past tense marker ed. This verb is an intransitive verb, which does not require an object, and none is provided. In the third sentence, the verb structure comprises of be verb, am, that serves as the main verb in the sentence, and requires a subject complement, so fast. For content, this refers to the meaning of the language, the words used and the meaning behind them. We humans convey content through our vocabulary system or lexicon as we select and organize words to express our ideas or to understand what other individuals are saying. Adelaide uses 12 words, and of these she repeats one word, I, several times. The words beating, wonned, and fast create lexical ties across the utterances because conceptually they work together to denote that a race of some type is occurring. The words that she uses and the concepts she expresses through these words are fairly concrete. She does not use figurative language or idiomatic words, nor does she use abstract language. The focus is clearly on the here and now. Language that focuses on the immediate context is contextualized, and typically the content of highly contextualized language is concrete and supported by cues within the environment. For example, gestures and facial expressions. By contrast, consider how this might sound different if Adelaide were telling the story of this race over the telephone to her grandmother. She would need to be much more precise to convey the content. Use, or pragmatics, pertains to how people draw on language functionally to meet personal and social needs. When you examine this domain of language, you are asking about the information behind the utterances and how well the utterances achieve these intentions. Thus, you examine the individual utterances to consider their intent. For the analysis of Adelaide's language usage, you can conclude that the intentions behind her utterances are personal, language used to express a state of mind. Examination of use, or pragmatics, also involves consideration of how well language achieves the intentions. For example, whether an individual can maintain a topic through several turns in a conversation, can regulate the participation of other people, for example, through eye contact, facial expressions, or pausing, and can adjust language given the particular demands of the communicative situation and the listener's needs. Because analysis of use requires understanding of the context in which language is occurring, fully considering use by looking at a written transcript alone is difficult. For example, we have no way of knowing whether this transcript from Adelaide's utterances is meeting the contextual needs of the situation and whether she is effectively regulating her language use to achieve her intentions. So our three main components of language are form, content, use. We can break form down further into phonology, the sound, morphology, the meaning, and syntax, the grammar or structure. We can break content down by thinking of meaning or semantics. And use, we can break that down by thinking of pragmatics. These are the rules that govern social use of language. So within these three constructs, form, content, use, we have 5 subdomains: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. The number 5 will be important in this course, and these 5 constructs of language will be ones that we revisit in the next several slides and in the next several sessions of this course. So how do children acquire language? What motivates them to learn? These are questions that have challenged researchers in child language development for many years. This slide and the 6 that follow present prevalent theories of language acquisition, detailing how each theory explains the phenomenon of language acquisition and discussing the contributions and limitations of each theory. Although no one model can fully explain the wonder of language acquisition, the effort to describe how children acquire language has helped us better understand the learning process and how we can be of help to the language and literacy development in children with a wide range of support needs. The behavioral theory offers an important contribution to our understanding of language acquisition. Most people's response to the question of how children learn language is that they learn through imitation. When pressed to describe how this might occur, people will say that the child hears what the adult says and tries to imitate it. It is a simplified form. This common sense explanation is similar to the actual process described in behavioral theories of language acquisition. This theory was set forth by B.F. Skinner in his 1957 book, Verbal Behavior. Skinner's behavioral theory of language acquisition places a great deal of emphasis on the role of the environment in language acquisition. The child is seen as a relatively passive recipient of external influences from caregivers, siblings, and others. Language, according to behavioral theory, is learned like any other behavior. Children begin with no language, and gradually they begin to imitate or model sounds of those individuals to whom they are most frequently exposed. These individuals respond to the sound outputs or operands by doing one of three things: reinforcing the verbal behavior, punishing the behavior, or ignoring the behavior. If reinforcement occurs, there's a good chance that the behavior in the child will occur again. If either of the other two responses happens, the likelihood of the verbal behavior recurring is reduced. Over time, the child's verbal behavior is repeated. The caregivers become less responsive to the force of the child to produce a verbal output that is closer to the adult model, or successive approximation. As Skinner put it, any response which vaguely resembles the standard behavior of the community is reinforced. When these begin to appear frequently, a closer approximation is insisted upon. Eventually, the child produces the adult word, and through the process of chaining, the child learns to string together several verbal behaviors to make an utterance. There's a good deal of support for the behavioral theory of language acquisition. This support comes from both structured research and from less formal observations of caregivers. There does appear to be a process of imitation and reinforcement at work in the child's acquisition of language, at least for first words. Caregivers provide a model for these words, and when their child responds, they respond in turn with enthusiastic joy. Over time, the child's verbal output does change in a similar way to that described by the theory, coming closer to the adult model. Moreover, there is some evidence that imitation is a critical component of language learning. For example, there's evidence that when mothers respond to their infants' vocalizations, the children appear to vocalize more. Other support for the behavioral theory of language learning comes from work with people with disabilities. This has claimed that children with significant language deficits can learn to acquire words through highly structured sequences based on a behavioral model such as discrete trial training. These are, however, serious limitations to the behavioral explanation of language acquisition. One is the theory makes the wrong prediction that what children will learn, particularly with regard to the order of word acquisition. If imitation were the primary process involved in word acquisition, then one would expect that the child's first word would be those heard most frequently. In English, the words a and the are the most frequently heard words, but these words are rarely, if ever, found in the language of young children. So that first problem is the idea of frequency and our expectation that we would hear a and the when we do not. The second problem is the theory of language acquisition through the behaviorist lens has some difficulty when it comes to explaining the phenomenon of novel productions. Young children have been found to use constructions that they've never heard previously. For example, children may say things like, I wented, instead of I went, when they use the past tense of go, and womans instead of women, when they want to pluralize the word woman. Behavioral theory alone does not account for these novel productions. A third problem with behavioral theory of language acquisition is that systematic observations of parents or caregivers indicate that caregivers actually tend to ignore grammatical errors and are more concerned about the truth value of what children say. For example, if the child said, I eated ice cream at grandma's, the parents are more likely to respond, no, you didn't, you ate Jell-O, than to say, no, we don't say eated, say ate. Behavioral theory also cannot account for the observation that comprehension usually precedes the production of language in children. That is, children can understand words and sentences before they produce them. Receptive language develops before expressive. If language learning theory occurs by process of reinforcement for language production, then how can it be that children can understand language before they can produce it? What about the evidence derived from children with disabilities to talk using behavioral techniques? Some researchers, thinking of Lovas in particular, have questioned his methods, have questioned Lovas's methods. Even if children can be taught to imitate and acquire words through reinforcement, this does not necessarily mean that this is how language is learned in natural environments. Nevertheless, there is value to the behavioral theory. First, this theory highlights the essential role that caregivers and significant others play in child's language learning. Second, the theory describes the process of language learning, although flawed, that has inspired others to develop alternative theories. Finally, the behavioral approach has been successful as a tool in the development of intervention approaches to enhance language skills of many persons with significant language difficulties and/or disorders. For these reasons, it's important to know about the behavioral theory of language acquisition and to use the observations of behaviorists as one source of information for the language intervention process. So in part 2 of this recording, I will introduce the nativist theory of language acquisition, followed by 3 others that get a lot of play in explaining how language is learned, how language is acquired for children in the best kind of sense of what we know now.